Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and this is going to be video number 6 in this intro to React 18. And in this last video, at least last video of this series, I'll be doing other videos, but they won't be under this particular playlist. And I have a lot of React videos, so you can just look up Alex Merced React, and you can find lots of videos to keep exploring and getting deeper into React. But the last thing to kind of explore is like how to do asynchronous things with React. Okay, basically making API calls. Like, what are the basics? Like, there's a lot of tools to help you do that. Like, there's a lot of cool third-party libraries to make things like React Query that make that piece a little bit easier. But how do I do it without extra tools? So what I'm going to do is make a new component. So we start off with another blank slate. So I'm going to create a new file. We're going to call this API call.js. Okay, and again, we're going to start off by just doing an export default function API call. Okay, and again, this component, this should be receiving props. And we should be able to, and do check out, like I do have another video, props masterclass and state masterclass, where I focus just on those two topics. Worth watching those videos. Just go on YouTube, search Alex Merced props, Alex Merced React state, and you will find the things. Okay, and what I want to do here is we're going to again just return a basic like h1 just to kind of test this out. API call. I'm going to head back to my app component, and I'm going to import API call, and we're going to get rid of the control form since we're not doing that anymore. Put in API call. Okay, cool. And then we get the server started. Let me just close out all these extra tabs now. API call. Okay, good. So it's there. Cool. So bottom line is this. Let's see, first let's figure out what data we're going to receive from an API. So I'm going to use JSON placeholder. It's like the best place with just some dummy API data to play with. Actually, what we'll do is we'll use the Pokemon data. Okay. So if I go to dummydata.netlify.app, this is just like some sample JSON files I put online. There's this Pokedex data. Okay, so you see there's like this big array of Pokemon. So when I take a look at this, what this is, it's an object with an array of Pokemon. I just want that array of Pokemon. So you can see that I'm going to make sure that my state is that array of Pokemon. So I know at the end of the day, my state should be an array. Okay. So I'm going to need to import some hooks. So I'm going to import useState, and I want to import been a while. useEffect. Okay, useEffect. There we go. That's we're going to be learning how to use useEffect today, which is a very fun hook. Yeah, one of the hooks that isn't obvious. Definitely is the least obvious up front. You know, useState creates state. useRef creates a ref. useEffect creates an effect. What does that mean? We'll talk about that. Okay, so first thing I want to do is create state to hold Pokemon, because again, theoretically, I don't have, like, anytime you make an API call, that data, the API call doesn't happen until after the first render, because the component's going to render, and it's not going to wait for the API call. Like in the future React, that's going to become a thing as a thing called suspense. But just basic React, the idea is that on the first render, that API call hasn't happened yet. So in that case, I need to know that when the data comes in, I'm going to have to update my data and cause the component to re-render, so that way it shows the data. So it should be state. So that way it's changing somewhere that'll trigger a render. Okay, so the reason why. So const Pokemon set Pokemon equals, and then we say use state, and it's going to equal an empty array to start off with. Okay, so now let's start building out our DOM. H1, oh not H1. We're going to make a div, and inside the div we're going to want our Pokemon. So I'm going to use the curly brackets and say Pokemon.map, because it's an array. And for each Pokemon in there, so for each, we'll say each Poke, can't use the word Pokemon again. You never want to use two variables with the same name if you can avoid it in the same scope. Poke, for each Poke of Pokemon, I want, and if we take a look at the Pokemon, each Pokemon object has a name and an image. So really what I'm going to want is I want a div. And in that div, I'm going to want an h1 that has the Pokemon.name. So Poke.name. And then image is also a top level property. So then I'm going to want a image tag with a source that equals Poke.image, because that's the URL to the image. So we want that to be the source of our image. Then I gotta make sure I include a closing tag there. Okay. And then it wants an alt property, so I'm going to give it one. So that way that little warning goes away, which should just be the name, Poke.name. Okay, cool. So right now, and I mean the app is running, but you don't see anything there because there's no Pokemon. Okay, because I haven't made any API call. So what happens is that I'm going to want to make a function that makes the API call. Okay, we want that to be an async function, asynchronous function. So I'll say async function, call it get Pokemon. And what this is going to do, it's going to say, const response equals, and we'll use the fetch function. And again, if you haven't used fetch, watch my videos on fetch. I'm not going to go too in depth about fetch right now. But again, I'm going to take this URL where the data is and say, hey, I want to fetch from there. Okay, and then I want to make sure I await it. Okay, and so now this is going to equal the response object, but that response object, the way fetch works, that you get a response object, and that response object isn't the data you need yet. There's an extra step. So I'm going to say const the data equals await response.json. That converts the data from the response into a JavaScript object. Okay, and then technically, then I want to set Pokemon, and I want to set Pokemon to data.poke. Yeah, it's called data.pokemon. Because I can see here, what do I get back from the API call? This object. But really what I want is the state to be this array, not the whole object. So I'm data.pokemon. Okay, cool. Now I just need a way to trigger this function. So what I'll do is I'll create a little button here. And whenever, get Pokemon. And we'll say on click equals, and whenever you click this function, it just runs the get Pokemon function. And that'll do it. Now watch it here. So right now there's no Pokemon. If I click get Pokemon, and see now they all populated. Because when I click that button, it runs the function, makes the API call, just like you would normally make an API call, and then sets the state to that data, and then the component re-renders. But the problem is I had to click that button. So if I refresh the page, it's back to nothing. What if I want the API call to happen the minute the page loads? Well, that's where things get a little bit more complicated. The only way to do this, because the problem is if I were to just say, if I were to just call the get Pokemon function right here in the body of the function, okay, like right here, what's going to happen is that function is going to run again, and it's going to keep updating the state over and over again, which causes another render, and then runs the function again. You don't want that to happen. You're going to create an infinite loop. So what you need to do is find a way that I say, hey, there's some code that I'd like to run, but I don't want to run that code on every render. That's what useEffect is for. useEffect is basically allows you to declare this function that only runs on the first render, or if some other things change, we'll get into that. So I would use the useEffect function. And that useEffect takes two arguments. It takes a callback. So we'll always just write an empty function first. And then the second thing, it takes an empty array. Okay, those are the two arguments to useEffect. I always just write out the skeleton first. Because if not, people always forget the array in the array. And you don't want to forget the array because you'll still create an infinite loop without it. So I write it out. And essentially the idea is this function will run on the first render. Okay, so I want to run get Pokemon right away. So I'm going to make a call to get Pokemon. And see, now it runs the minute the page loads. So if I refresh the page, is just going to automatically get the Pokemon. But let's say there was some other variable that if it changed, I want to run this function again, I would put it in this array. These are called dependencies. Usually it's some other unrelated state, or maybe related state. But the idea is like there's some other state that if it changes, this thing should happen again. Okay, that's what this array is. There's another thing you can do here. This is like more of a side point. Rarely do you need this. But this function could return another function. And that function would run if that component's ever removed. So if that component's removed, it'll call that function that you returned. That's more of an advanced thing. It's the only reason you would ever use that is because you're putting event listeners on the window object, and you want to make sure you get rid of those listeners when you remove the component. Again, not something you're typically doing, especially in the early stages of like as a developer. So if you're just watching this introduction to React series, chances are it's not something you're really going to need anytime soon. But that's what useEffect does. So again, the idea is if I need to run code, so think useEffect is basically saying I want to run this function, but not on every render. Only on the first render, so when the component first renders, and anytime any variable in here updates. Those are the only two times I want this function to run. Okay, so then what I do is I nest my function to get the API in there. That's going to call the API when the component first loads. And that's that. That's pretty much how you would make API calls. Now, one thing that's always, nice is always trying to trying to move some of this logic outside. So what you can do is it's called custom hooks, where you take some of this logic and you move it elsewhere, so that way you can call it in here. So basically, it would look something like this. So if I were to create a new file, and we'll call it like usePokemon.js. So I want to create a custom hook. So we'll say function, export default function use Pokemon. You always call your custom hooks with the word use in front of it. Okay. And the basic idea here is that you're going to take all that hook logic and move it into here, so that way you don't have to have it polluting your component. So that way your component looks a little less complicated. So I can just take everything I need to kind of create that Pokemon state and move it in here. So what I'll do is I'll just import, use state and use effect. And then what I'll do is I'll copy this logic here. I'm going to copy all this logic, take it out of here. I'm going to get rid of this button. We're not going to need this button anymore. Okay. And that's going to all error out for a second, so we'll leave it. But I'll move it into this function here. Okay. So this function has all the logic to do the API call, so the same logic. But then at the end, what I want to do is I want to return the state Pokemon and set Pokemon. But I don't have to worry about making that initial API call. That's all set. I can return maybe any kind of custom functions that I may want to, in case I want to make the API call again, maybe I return the get Pokemon function. So that way all three of these things are kind of in there. Okay. But this function now kind of encloses that logic. And then what I can do here is instead just import use Pokemon. And then I can just declare that state here. Constant, let me just see what I returned. I returned an array, right? Yep, I returned an array with these three functions. So I can destructure that array. So it would be Pokemon, get Pokemon. Oh no, set Pokemon is the second one. Set Pokemon, get Pokemon from use Pokemon. Okay, and see it works. So essentially now this file has gotten a lot slimmer. So you see, and then basically this is a lot more clear because maybe I'm another developer on your team. I don't need to know how you got the Pokemon, but I do kind of need to have an idea where they came from. So I do, now this is clear for me to read. I can see like, hey, okay, this is getting the Pokemon data, and it's going to give me the state. It's going to give me a function to set the Pokemon and another function to make that API call again. And I can use those as needed. And but again, I've hidden all of that. I've made this one file a lot less complicated. And now this function now here I can just focus on like what the UI looks like instead of having all this business logic also polluting with the UI logic and just having a lot of stuff in one file, which makes it kind of hard to read. So again, as you get more advanced with React, shifting some of this hook usage and shifting it and nesting it into custom hooks. Also, the nice thing about using custom hooks when you do something like this is that if you take a look at React Dev Tools, if I go to React Dev Tools and I go to API call, see instead of seeing like state hook, I see a Pokemon hook. It actually will show you a hook by the custom name, and then I can see like the things inside that hook. So I can see inside that custom hook, there's state, and then there's an effect. So I can see exactly what that state is, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me to identify what's going on in my file because I can now have custom names showing up in my dev tools, which makes it easier for me to know like, hey, which state is relative to my Pokemon. So sometimes you might just want to create custom hooks just for the better use of dev tools or something like that. So yeah, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that. That'll kind of complete this series on React. This is like became a little bit more advanced than I expected to, but also kind of gave you a nice thorough going over a lot of these basic foundational pieces too. Hopefully you guys enjoy that. My name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Again, you can find a lot more React videos from me over there on YouTube. You can also head over to grokoverflow.com. If you go over here and you go to videos, you can find lots of playlists. So you can find whatever you're learning, you can find a playlist for it. And let me show you the way. So have a great day and enjoy. I'll see you all later.